Thank you, Mr. Toastmaster. Good evening, fellow Toastmasters. Did you know that in February of 2004, a journalist from the Guardian newspaper named Ben Hammersley coined the term podcast? And less than 2 years later, by December of 2005, the word was appearing in dictionaries. I don't know if that's a quick process normally or a slower one than that, but it's one of the tidbits from history that I found while researching for this speech today. About 6 months ago, I launched a podcast called People I Know Show. And since then, I've realized that everyday people that I know, have a wildly different understanding and knowledge of podcasts and use for podcasts. Therefore, I decided that it would be helpful to me and my audience, and perhaps all of you here, if I research podcasts so I can provide a better understanding of the history of the concept and how prominent podcasts are now today. One thing I found is in the early history of podcasts, things happened slowly, as the Discover Pods infographic that I've handed out will demonstrate. I know the text is small, but hopefully you can read the timeline a little bit. Dave Weiner and Adam Curry spent a few years in the early 2000s figuring out a way for an RSS feed to not just push text to those people that wanted it, but also audio. And by September of 2003, the first audio RSS feed was in use. It's from that, a few months later, where the term podcast was then coined to describe the audio that was received through that RSS feed. In June of 2005, podcasts could be downloaded for the first time to iTunes and thus synced to an iPod. Do you remember those things? With the greater awareness, podcast was in the dictionary by December of that year. Around that time, 11% of the U.S. population had listened to a podcast. Podcasts showed steady growth over the next decade, but one particular show brought podcasts to the mainstream. It was in the fall of 2014, National Public Radio, as an extension of one of their long-running popular shows, This American Life, released the podcast Serial. Serial was an investigation into a true story of a Baltimore area murder involving a high school student, her ex-boyfriend, who was then convicted as the killer, and whether or not he was the actual killer. It was 12 episodes. It was released weekly for about 3 months. A PBS Newshour report around that time indicated that 5 million downloads of Serial on iTunes was far more than any other podcast in history. I was one of the millions of fans. I don't think I listened to it week by week as it came out, but it was becoming very popular, and then I found out about it, and that was my introduction into podcasts. I downloaded it for the first time, 12 episodes. I think it was 2 or 3 days. I binge listened to Serial and realized that podcasts had a value in my life. And something happened a couple years before Serial, which might have helped the popularity at that time. The online resource PowerPress Podcast noted that it became possible to download podcasts directly to a smartphone in 2012, no longer needing to sync your device to your computer to get the podcast on your device to take it mobilely. As you'll see in the timeline, about 30% of the U.S. population had listened to a podcast prior to Serial being released in 2014. And in the few years after, that was up to 40% by 2017. What about now? As of this year, 2019, 51% of the population has now listened to a podcast. That's according to Podcast Insights, another online resource. That's up from 44% of people last year. That's the largest annual increase. Half of those individuals listen at home, while nearly a quarter of them will listen in their car. In other places that people might listen might be at work, which I'm curious for how productive people might be, depending on what they're listening to, while on public transportation, or possibly while exercising. The website Statista reports that 32% of Americans have listened to a podcast in the last month. What are they listening to? According again to Podcast Insights, there are now more than 700,000 shows and 29 million available episodes in over 100 languages globally. My podcast, People I Know Show, is one of the plethora of about 150,000 new shows launched since last summer. It's a lot of competition. How are people listening? According to the feed, which is the official Libysn podcast, Libysn, Liberated Syndication, is one of the most popular podcast hosting websites. About 60% listen on Apple Podcasts, which is the podcast app that comes to you when you buy an iPhone. It's already on there. And about 6% and growing listen on Spotify, which has been a music app, but has transitioned into podcasts, as have other apps. And as of this report, which was from last year, no other podcast apps had more than 3% of the total podcast listens. And there are many different podcast apps. If you search a podcast player on either the iTunes Store on Apple or for Android apps for podcast players on the Google Play Store, you'll find dozens of podcast player apps. Some of them better than others, some have features that other ones might not have. And I myself am someone that's stuck in Apple Podcasts, which probably isn't the best one out there. So I'm about to start searching to see if I can find one that suits my needs even better. So what have we learned about podcasts? It went from a concept to a thing to a word in about the first 5 years. And then it enjoyed steady growth over the next 10 years. And in the last 5 years, we've gone from about 30% of the U.S. population to about 51% having listened at least one time to a podcast. And if you have a smartphone, which I know most of us, but not all of us do, it's easy to listen anywhere you go. And perhaps half of you might already know this, and the other half now might have a better understanding of how to join into the podcast listening trend. Mr. Toastmaster?